All right, everybody, welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider. I'm your host, Christian Bacasa. This week we have a special guest again, Dan Gracia. Dan is a former guide, has been fishing since 1976, actually the year I was born. So he's a biennial angler, I guess you could say, Dan. You've been teaching schools, excuse me, you've been guiding, as I mentioned, but you had a couple really cool mentors, and that was Dean Schubert and Dave Hickson. Those guys mentored you in a number of ways, and you ended up teaching for them and learned a technique called the hinged nymphing technique. We're going to talk about that today. In addition to that, we're going to wrap up the show with our tip, and our tip is how to nymph with an indicator on spring creeks and what to look for in those situations. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind everybody, please leave a review. Rate us if you can and leave a nice review. That helps us a ton of ways on Apple Podcasts. You just scroll down until you start to see reviews, and there'll be a leave a review button there. The other thing is don't forget to go to our website, www.ffipodcast.com, and check it out. There is a blog section there that I've started, and I've been releasing articles left and right. There's some really good information there for you to learn, to go provide shopping lists for holidays, etc. But yeah, check that out and get back to the show here. So Dan, it's really good to meet you finally in person here on the video and talk through some things with you. But can you do me a favor? Can you just provide us a little history on how you met Dean and Dave and how that all came about?
Sure. Real quick, though, I need to make a little correction. The last name is Gracia. It's not Garcia. It's Portuguese.
Oh, okay.
Nobody ever gets it. It's okay.
No worries. Yeah.
Yeah.
I read it wrong.
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, everybody does, particularly in California. Yeah, sure. I didn't start fly fishing until 1976 when I bought a fly rod for my brother-in-law's birthday, and a week before he bought a better one. So my wife said, keep it. Get a line, rent a reel. My dad used to do this. You'll like it. Pardon me. And so I did. Had no idea what I was doing. Went to the local lake. You kind of make these loop things, she was saying, and it was going pop, pop, pop in the air. And I said, so I started doing pop, pop, pop. Is it supposed to do that? I don't know. So after being able to pop, pop, pop it a few times, I tied on a fly and walked down to the thing and pop, pop, fly was gone. Pop, pop, fly was gone. Pop, pop, dang, that's $6 so far. Back when flies were $2. And,
right.
And I said, no, it's not supposed to pop. Anyhow, I had a really tough time getting started in fly fishing. I was terribly determined. That was the worst rod, by the way. It's a good thing I didn't give it to him. It was an extendable 7.5 foot, 7-weight rod. It was bad. So I kept at it, and I struggled, and I picked up tying flies when I dropped a pocket full of flies from my brother-in-law into the river in a 10-foot deep hole where I couldn't get it, so I had to replace those. Tying flies I thought would make good sense. It did. But what finally happened was I moved back to California, which is where I'm originally from. I was living in Oregon at the time. And I had to go to see a real Orvis store, and I went in there and I talked to the guys in the fishing area, and I ended up tying steelhead flies for them because Ed Haas, who had been tying flies for them, had just passed away. And so they needed some things filled in. So I was doing that, and I met Dean Schubert one day when he came in there. And Dean Schubert was the director of the Orvis West Coast Fly Fishing Schools. And we talked a bit, and then one day I get this call from him, and we talk a little bit more, and he's asking me about what knots I use and, all this stuff. And then he says, well, I need an assistant instructor to help out at one of my schools up in Oregon. Are you interested? And I said, yeah. And so I went up. Oh, yeah, immediately. I didn't ask him how much money it was, how I was going to get there, where in Oregon it was. Oregon's a pretty good-sized place.
Yeah,
anyhow, you bet. So I went up there, and it's a good 8.5 hour drive up to a place called the Take It Easy Ranch at Fort Klamath, which is no longer there. That's gone. A terrible tragedy there, but that's no longer open to the public. I don't think there's any fish there anymore either. But it was spectacular Spring Creek, and I got up there, and in that 4-day school, I learned more from Dean just being an assistant instructor there and seeing what he looked for in his casting technique and listening to all the information that he just filled me up with and filled everybody up with about fly fishing and fish. And I learned more in that 4-day school than I had in my entire 11 years of trial and error and trying to find every bit of information I could from him. So I always think of him as a mentor. He poo-poos that, but yeah, he was it. And Dave Hickson was his partner, I guess you would call it. They both rented a room in a house, and I didn't see him very often. We'd end up fishing some places, and he'd come by. You had to be careful with him because we used to fish the North Umpqua River for steelhead, and you'd be out there. It's a crazy hard place to wade because it's so dang slippery. So everybody at the time used corkers with the studs on them. You know, they really were made for working logs originally. And even then, you'd still go swimming once a day. And he came up, and I was talking to him, and the next thing I know, he's fishing my spot. And I said, Dave, you can go down there and fish. This is where I'm fishing. But he was really good. He was a very fine caster. Dean is probably the best fly fisherman I've ever fished with, ever seen, and that includes such greats as Andre Pouillans, which he learned from actually. And but in particular, his ability to get drag-free drifts anywhere and his mending techniques were just remarkable. They're just remarkable. I learned crazy amounts from him. So, and then I taught schools with him from 1987 through 1997. It was great.
Let me do this. You mentioned Dean as this mentor. He's obviously an excellent angler, but what was it about him that kind of drew you in to want to learn from him besides his knowledge set?
The first thing, he's a very amiable person. He's a non-threatening person, you know, and nobody's ever intimidated by him. He's not a big guy. Nobody's ever intimidated by him, but he has a rather soft-spoken way of talking, and he's really good at relating to the different students. And that is a real trick in teaching and something that you got to pay big attention to, because the similes and metaphors that you use with one student may not, work at all with another student. And so you got to try and find what things work. And he was just excellent at it, and never made it too complex. Never spoke too much, like maybe I do. And but he was just crazy knowledgeable, and he was great at imparting that knowledge. And people had questions to ask, and he virtually always had the answers. The very first thing that that really made me go, oh, I need to listen to this guy, was when we went out to do casting, because we'd come in the night before and have dinner and have a little orientation meeting, and then the next morning we would come out and have a little stuff going on in the classroom for a couple hours, and we go out and we do some casting for about an hour. We come back in, do some more stuff, and then go back out and casting. And the very first thing that I learned from him was, I don't need to hold my arm up here to cast. This is not how I get it. Just give it here, down here. If you just hold your arm up, you're going to get tired. Yeah, you're going to get tired. So, if you just bend at the elbow and keep it down here, there's very little tension in that at all. Now, actually, okay, so I'm a big guy now, big around, not tall. And so I actually have to move mine up a little bit to avoid my tummy, but, and still get the accuracy that I want. I have to physically think, okay, no, move it back over here. And then it is a little harder for my accuracy because I'm coming like this instead of like this. So, my line is going to go, because the line can only follow the tip of the rod. Wherever the tip of the rod goes, that's where your line's going. So can only follow that. And from an angle like this, it's harder to be as accurate as you can be when you can really come just straight on it. So that was the first thing. I pulled that down. All of a sudden, my fly fishing was a lot easier. And then knots, I knew the best way to tie knots. I learned a lot of on knots that I thought I knew. In particular, never draw up a dry knot. Always lubricate your knot. You're fishing right. Dip it in the water if you don't want to put it in your mouth and put some saliva on it. Dip it in the water before you pull it tight, because if you don't, there's a huge amount of friction when those nylon and copolymers and fluorocarbons draw up, and it tends to melt the top of the doggone stuff. and it'll often not draw up entirely. And so when you're fishing and the water's there and it's colder and it lubricates it more, what very often happens is it slips. And once it starts slipping, it typically continues. You get this nice little curlicue. If you ever get a curlicue back on the end of your tippet, that means you're not slipped. It didn't fail.
Yep.
So
Yep.
anyhow, he just
good advice.
Wealth of info.
That's
He's a
good,
wealth
good
of info.
advice.
Yeah.
So let's dive into the nymphing technique. He
Sure.
taught you and described a technique called the hinged nymphing technique. I'm going to bring up a slide so you can kind of talk through that. But before we do that, I'd really like you to talk about, some of the advantages of the technique, and then we'll get into how to set it up. That's where we'll bring up the slide. And the last is what do you do to really work it? How do you work it?
Yeah, well, the first thing, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get your fly within a 1 foot circle of where your indicator is. You always hear, oh, we set up a nymph, it's going to be 1.5 times the depth of the water. And you have no clue where your fly is going to be. Depending on the current, it might be 3 feet off to this side or 3 feet off to that side or 2 feet up there. And the chances of it being dead drift are darn few. So what they did, and they did it with a rather bulky system originally and then refined it over the years. But basically what they did was they used a little piece of yarn on the end of about, like say, a 7.5 foot 4X leader. Tied a little bit of yarn on it. So here it is like this. And then they tied tippet onto the line right behind that yarn so that it really was a hinge. It really was this 90-degree thing going down, and you made sure that tippet was the same diameter all the way down. If you're using 6X tippet on your fly, then you need to have a 6X tippet coming up to that to the indicator. And if you're in 4 feet, you need to have a 4 foot section of that. If you're in 3 feet, you need to have 3 foot. What you want to do is get down in that bottom 6 to 9 inches. So here's a nice little thing that I put together to explain it to folks at Orvis when I was working down there and I had to do some instructional stuff. And this is your 7.5 foot 2X to 4X leader, depending upon what you're using, what you're fishing for. You can use 2X and then run 4X and 6X off of it. You always want to make sure you got at least 2X difference in diameter between the leader that runs up to your indicator and the tippet material that goes down to the bottom. There's a trick on getting this sucker to work like this, because if you just cast it straight out, over the water and boom, and your indicator ends up downstream, bloop, 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 and your fly is up here, the top of the water typically runs faster than the bottom of the water. And so it's pulling your fly along, and your fly is under tension and it very slowly sinks, and you have to put a lot of weight on it to get it to sink. So the trick is you get the fly and the split shot to go in first, and then you get the indicator to come in last. And the indicator will sit on top and push slack, absolutely just push slack at that fly. And it will sink just as fast as if you'd taken that fly, take like a beadhead fly sometime and just drop it in the water and watch it go down. That's how long it's going to take your fly to get down there, because there is no tension on it. And when you do it right, you have... Go ahead.
When you cast and you're trying to get that weight and fly in the water first, are you casting and just leaving your rod tip high so that it shoots that kind of downward? Is that your technique?
Yeah, the very simplest thing to do is just open your cast up about 4 feet above the water, and it will quite literally come plop like that and drop down. It will, and if it's a windy day and you can't really do that and get the fly to go where you want to, then you want to overpower the cast a little bit, open it down lower, or use like one of Humphrey's tuck cast or the up down cast, and get that over there. And any of those things will make that pop over and go in. But it's critical that you get that yarn indicator behind the fly. It has to hit the water after the fly goes down, and it needs to be behind the fly. So once it does that, again, it shoves just nothing but slack at it, and it sinks like a stone. It's, like a little stone, because you typically use a little bit of split shot. I virtually never use anything bigger than a BB shot, even on the fastest water, with this technique, and it works just great. So as you can see on this slide right here, the line coming down from the indicator, and I like to use yarn indicator just because it is the most sensitive, and I used to fish a lot of spring creeks, and that's where we held our fly fishing schools, were on spring creeks. And it'll pick up stuff that round indicators and bubble indicators and things won't pick up. So here you're in 4 feet of water. You got your whole section from the yarn to the fly is going to be 4 feet long. And what you want to do normally is put your split shot about anywhere from 4 to 8 inches from the fly. 6 inches is what I almost always use. If I've got it 6 inches from the fly and I'm missing fish, then I will move it closer. But 4 inches is about it, because after that, the fly no longer moves realistically in the water. But if the weight is in that little split shot and not in the fly, then the fly has that 6 inches to move along with the microcurrents as it floats down there, and it just drifts more realistically. If I am not getting strikes, and I know there's fish there because I can see them, I may move it back as far as 8 inches. The farther back you move it, the less sensitive it is to strikes, because it takes longer for the movement to come tight to your split shot. Because you can see the line from the yarn down to the split shot, it's tight. There's tension there. And then the line from your split shot to your fly, there's no tension. So they have to straighten out whatever you've got there before it'll move your split shot. And when it moves your split shot, it moves your indicator. So the trick is, go ahead.
When you tie into the indicator, are you using a tippet ring or a swivel there or something to get that 90 degree, or you're just using a standard? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the tippet rings, because they're always heavier than the monofilament is. So it's a pretty simple thing, actually. And when you're tying around a little bit bigger thing. So what I typically do when I'm tying the tippet onto the behind the yarn, I will use an improved clinch knot, a 5-turn improved clinch knot on that, and draw that down tight. Then when I'm tying the fly on the other end, I use the Orvis knot, which is 100% knot, and the problem with doing that was it often would break the doggone tippet up on the yarn. So the other knot that I'll use on that is the Orvis tippet knot, because that's also 100%. But and all you do is you before you slide it up entirely, that's the cool thing on that. You can lubricate it, pull the tag a little bit to get it closer, and then let go of the tag and pull the standing end of the line and pull it tight. And that knot, that needs to seat without any tension on the tag. If you do it with tension on the tag, it'll leave you a spot. Not such a disaster with an improved clinch knot, because you can actually use that to make a loop, but regular clinch knot, that'll come apart every single time. So all you're doing is you've got this heavier thing here and this skinnier thing here, and it just comes down like that. And then, and then you just, it's up to you to get the dead drift. Be aware that the water moves more slowly down at the bottom. And so what's going to happen is pretty soon your indicator is going to start doing this, and it's going to start pulling your fly. And that's another reason I like the yarn. It's pretty easy, comparatively easy to see that happens, because here's your little puff ball, and it starts going, like that, and it turns to
tilting,
the side. Yeah. Oops. Okay. So, I've overrun it. I need to reset it. And then you flip it back over, give it a little mend. Yeah. Put your mend in to, again, push it forward, let it feed slack to it. And away you go.
With your split shot, I'm going to ask you a question about your split shot.
Sure.
Do you put some kind of stopper in there to keep that from sliding around on that tippet, or do you just clamp hard, or what's your technique?
Well, you got to be careful, because it was a little easier with lead actually than the tin antimony stuff that we use now, but better for the environment. So, and it works fine. So, but the deal is you want to clamp it tight enough, but not too tight. If you clamp it tight enough, these things just kind of melt together like that. And if you clamp it too tight, they go like this. They go whoop, like that. And then or they will clamp like this and go like that, and then they just slide. And the only real answer is cut off your fly, slide that off, put another one on, and push it. So, and that's a matter, you got to do it too tight sometimes and too loose sometimes until you finally figure it out. It's an experiential thing. But I don't.
Sometimes I'll put a knot in there. I'll tie like a blood knot in, and then put the lead right above the blood knot, and then that blood knot acts as a stopper.
Yeah, and that
It
works.
just
The only
depends on
problem
how
is
my
you're
day's
giving up.
going.
Yeah, the only problem with doing that is you just reduce the breaking strength of your line, by at
Yeah.
least 5%. Blood knot's typically a 95% knot. And honestly, when you're going after big fish, you want every bit of strength that's in there. Also,
Yeah.
another thing is if you tie in just a short piece of something with a blood knot on it, or with any knot for that matter, you got to remember what makes a knot break is the line stretches until the stretch is gone, and then it pops. And if you only have a piece of line this big, as opposed to a piece of line that's 3 or 4 feet long, that is going to max out a lot more quickly.
That's a great
So
point. Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I like to just run that full part. And of course, that's the disadvantage of using this is really, if you're doing it right, you'll cut that, tip it off and change it. If you go down into 5 feet of water or 6 feet of water, you need to cut that sucker off and put it on instead of just tying
Reline.
a
Yep.
knot on it. Yeah, so,
Okay.
but it's just a freaking deadly thing. And it allows your fly to move naturally. And you'd be amazed at how many big fish you can catch on a size 18 fly with 6X tippet and not break them off once you figure out how to fight fish.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially these days, 6X tippet is really strong.
Yeah, well, it's typically 3 to 3.5 pound test.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, so here we're going to get into a little bit of the weeds. Copolymers stretch quite a bit more than fluorocarbons do. Fluorocarbons don't stretch very much, very, very little. So you can get the copolymers used to be the ones that always had the higher breaking strength, and then the fluorocarbons came up with a higher breaking strength typically than the fluorocarbons. But the problem is they reach that breaking strength much quicker because they don't stretch as much. So pardon me. You just have to get used to, and again, it's an experiential thing. You're gonna have some successes and some failures until you figure out just how much you can use on a
Setup. Yeah.
on a particular material before it goes. And that's
I
pulled too hard.
Do you use a monofilament on your leader and then a fluorocarbon on below the indicator?
No, I don't. I use the fluorocarbon when I'm swinging flies. If I'm fishing streamers, and if I'm swinging steelhead flies, then fluorocarbon, and saltwater for that matter, then fluorocarbon absolutely is what I'm using. But for dead drift tactics, I use the monofilament because I have much better control over what floats and what doesn't float. One of the problems with using fluorocarbons as the main part of the leader, like the 7.5 foot 4X part of the leader, it sinks. And you can't control it. You just can't. It goes underneath the water, and you can't get it up without jerking your fly, feet. So
yeah.
So no,
it's
I don't.
harder to mend. There's a lot of things that happen that you don't realize.
Yeah, because
hard to mend. You get all the microcurrents on your indicator, etc. It makes quite a difference, I think.
Yeah, it really does. But it's great at what it's for. When you use it for the things that are sunken presentations and tension techniques, it's dynamite for that, because the doggone fish, they really don't see that very well at all. It matches so closely with the refractive index of water. They take it with abandon, whereas if you use 4X at a place where you need to use 6X in a spring creek, for instance, catching trout, with a copolymer, who are you? I don't know.
I'm not even going to look at it, right?
That's way too big. That's Hauser cake. And honestly, the real problem with it is that it alters the drift. You're trying to get a dead drift. So, I always get everything the same from top to bottom. So there's no bit of water pushing more here faster to make it go like this. And the copolymer is my choice of it.
Okay. Interesting. Very cool. So now you have your setup. So let's talk about the technique of getting into the pools, where you like to use it, where you don't like to use it, and how to adjust it while you're using it, et cetera, to be very effective.
Okay. Primarily, I like to use it anywhere where I need to do a dead drift tactic. I don't use it typically in the early part of the year when the waters are flooded and the what do you call it? The river is just not clear.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's all kinds of junk in there. And in those kind of situations, actually, and this is backwards from a dead drift situation, movement means life. You know, and so a very effective way of nymph fishing is to cast out with just some split shot. Again, I keep the split shot usually about 6 inches away. So no indicator, cast off, cast it up, throw a mend at it, boom, maybe 2 mends, boom, to make sure you get enough slack there that it sinks quickly. And then once it sinks, and it's just kind of like high sticking, once it sinks, you lift the line up until the tension goes out. And as soon as you see the last of the slack go like that and it stops here, okay, then that's where you want to keep that. And you want to pull it downstream just slightly faster than the top of the water is going. And this is a tension technique. And then you'll feel it. You know, whereas dead drift, you don't feel it. But that tension technique is not nearly as effective as the dead drift techniques are during most of the year. So during most of the year, I absolutely use the hinged nymphing system, and it's deadly. The nice thing is you can, if you do it right, you make that nice cast so it opens up in the air, and the fly and the split shot go into the water, and then the indicator goes into the water. That fly is going to be within about a 1 foot circle of that. And, you know, so you can pick which side of the rock you're going. You can pick which side of the seam you're going. I'm going to get this side of the seam, get that side of the seam. I want to get a little closer to this rock this time. It really allows you to strategically fish. You know, you have so much finer control over it with that.
Yeah, you can.
So it makes a.
You can really grid it
difference.
out.
It makes a.
You can grid out your fishing of like, okay, I know. Excuse me. If I use this line, I'm going essentially 6 inches in either direction. So I can move my fly over really 12 inches and know that I'm hitting the same waters, edge to edge, right?
Well, you can you can get the next section of water and the next section of the water, as opposed to being here with a 1.5 times the length of the tippet up to the water and have no idea if your fly is over here or over there.
Right. Which way did the current take it, right?
Yeah. And if you ever want to see something like that, put on a big orange fly and put it down in the water, and you'll see what the current does to those things. I did that on the North Umpqua River one time when Dean and I were fishing, and we would typically fish in the middle of the day because we were nymph fishing then. The guys who were swinging primarily fished in the morning and the afternoon. So we slept in, we'd go fishing, and then we'd go to dinner and go back to camp, and they would fish like crazy. And we didn't interfere with them. But I spotted this fish, and he was just a nice steelhead. He was probably a 14-pound steelhead, and he was in a spot, and I was getting the drift, and I wasn't getting him, and he was in about 5 feet of water. So I should have got him. And then I put on an orange fly on that, and here's the fish, and the fly comes along, and as it gets here, it goes, whoa, there's a big current that just goes around him on that place.
In the dead water.
And he's sitting in this, exactly. And I just am not having any luck, and I called Dean over and said, Dean, I cannot get this guy. Take a look at him. See this? And then I cast and showed him what the water was doing. I'm at a loss. How do you do this? And he looked at him, and he went like this, and then he went cast.
He stole your
hooked
fish.
Him right up.
Let me show you how it's done. Son.
Well, it was fine. It was fine. He taught me a lesson.
I'm gonna teach you a lesson. This is my fish.
But it's funny. He says, well, you see, it went over there, so you need to get over here to get in this current lane so that it could finally get to him.
Right.
And what he was actually doing was casting in, and it was coming real close alongside the rock. And
taking the current initially.
Just slightly, Well, see, because the current kind of split, and then it came back this way. And it always split, and mine always went that way, and he managed to get his to come here. And then when it started to join back in, it came right in front of the fish, and he just sucked it right out.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
I'll take that. No.
Yep. What a visual way to learn, too, huh? Isn't that neat?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's nothing that beats that. That's why we did our schools primarily on spring creeks, because you could see the fish to the fish, see how the fish reacted to your presentation, and adjust your presentation accordingly. So, that was a great place to teach people because, that the fish is there, whereas you're fishing mostly freestyle streams. You don't know the fish is there. They should be there, but you typically can't see them. The water's too fast, too blurred up, and So
yeah, you get all
but
the
yeah,
indications that this is where fish live, and it should be,
yeah,
and you believe it,
yeah,
but you can't see it and physically tell until you catch something,
yeah,
and it's validation.
yeah,
So very, very interesting.
yeah. So
Let me do this. You
yeah, and
you you talked. Go ahead. Go ahead. You finish your thought.
oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot it already.
Okay, so you had indicated earlier to me that in this hinge technique there were some disadvantages, and one of the disadvantages I wanted you to describe was fishing the tail out of a pool and why it's not as
Oh, sure.
effective there. So, can you talk about that?
Yeah, actually, it can still be effective, but it's not as effective as fishing in the main part of the river, along the
Okay.
sides of the river, the heads of pools, in riffles and stuff. But the problem is when you get into a tail out, particularly a tail out that slants up like this. The water's here and it slants up like that. As the water volume comes along here, it compresses. And of course, there's no place for the water on the bottom to go. And so what happens is the water on the top speeds up.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you do, what I was talking about very quickly, your indicator is past the fly and pulling it along.
Mm-hmm.
So at a tail out like that, you actually do want to make what I'd otherwise call a bad cast and cast it so everything straightens out. Boom, as far upstream like that as possible, because then it comes the water will start pushing it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Did I just say that backwards? I think I just said
No,
that
you
backwards.
got. I think you got it right. You're making
Yeah.
the straight cast because
Yeah.
you want your fly to land ahead of the indicator, so the indicator pushes over top of it and allows the fly to drop. Is that correct?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, interesting technique because you're right. At the tail out, that compression really speeds up and you can often miss things.
Yeah, it really does.
The nice thing about having a tight cast like that is when you cast out ahead of yourself, you're putting tension in the line consistently with your cast. And as it's falling, it's maintaining tension until the indicator gets to it. Versus, sometimes you cast like that and
Christian,
you just have a bunch of slack in the line.
Oh yeah, yeah, Christian. I think I misspoke on that. I'm because the bottom of the line is running out. I did it backwards. The water the water speed increases down at the bottom instead of being slower. It's faster, and then what happens is it comes down and it hits that, and then it overtakes your indicator as it goes by. That kind of a situation is probably better to use like the short line nymphing stuff that I was talking about earlier.
Okay, so like
getting
tight
that
lining,
down, getting a
like
little
that.
slack.
Okay.
Yeah, tight lining it down there. Right. But I was shocked. I fished tail outs, the way I fished the rest of the river for years until I put an orange fly on and see what the heck is this doing, and whoop, down it went. And I went, oh crap, that's what it's doing.
Yeah,
okay,
how do I change that?
And away it went. Yeah. So
yeah, I really like how you have learned. It's funny because you talk a lot about the visual aspects. It's very clear to me that you learn on a spring creek because you've observed it.
Yeah.
And part of your problem solving is observation of your own fly and what's happening underwater. So I think that's just a great tip in itself is, try to find really clear water and watch what's happening with the fly. Stop looking at your indicator. Stop looking at the stuff above the water, but look what's actually happening below. And you can learn a ton.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, when you're, I don't know if it's too early to mention it, but when you're fishing spring creeks, you actually fish slightly differently using that hinged nymphing method. And the main difference is when the fly gets when your indicator rather gets within about 2 feet of your target fish that you can see, or that you know where he is, you stop looking at the indicator and you look at the fish. And you watch the fish for a feeding move. Because what will happen is a fish is here like this, and a feeding move is choom, choom, goes off and snaps back. If he goes to either side and snaps back, and you're within about a foot, your indicator's within about a foot and a half of that, strike. Odds are he's got you. And if he doesn't have you, okay, he doesn't. But if you don't strike, you'll never know.
Right.
And the other thing that they'll do is they will move over. They'll be here like this, and they'll go whoop and stop. They'll move over quickly and come to a stop. And again, they've either got your fly or they don't. That is a feeding move, and they ate something. And if you're within that foot of that fish, you need to set the hook. And then the final thing is, and this is kind of funny because I can't tell you how many fish I've missed because of this. If you're upstream of the fish and you're watching your indicator go down, and then you start watching the fish, when he opens his mouth, you're going to get this big flash of white. Wait until the flash goes away and then strike off to the side. Because what happens is if you see that and you strike when you see the white, here comes the fly, boom, and you pull it away. You strike and pull it away before he can close his mouth. So the best thing to do is as it comes along and you see that, wait for it to close and then strike off to the side, which will put it
right in that corner,
right here in the corner of the mouth.
And I like how you describe.
And then that's a very secure.
You describe the white because it does. It's white jawline. I mean, it's what you're seeing.
Oh yeah,
is the unexposed, normally unexposed jawline. But if you pull too early, you just pull it right out.
Yeah. And, if you ever go steelhead fishing and you're skating flies along the surface, that's the same thing, only the fish will hit it, and they're explosive when they go after a skating fly. And you have to do that same thing. You always, actually, when I'm doing that and I'm skating a fly, I have my rod tip high and I have this slack line coming down, and I can adjust it a little faster or slower if I want to, just by pulling on it or maybe dropping a little slack to it. And when a fish comes up and explodes on it, drop the rod all the way to the water and then off to the side. And most of the time, not always, but most of the time you'll hook him. But otherwise, I can't tell you how many times I did that on the North Umpqua in the evening before I learned, okay, you got to wait. He's a big fish. He's moving a lot of water. Big, huge explosives flash. Wait for it and then strike. So anyhow, same thing happens with there. One other thing that I might touch on, if it's okay, is fighting big fish, because there's a real method to that, and it's actually pretty simple when you think about it, but nobody ever does. I shouldn't say nobody. It usually has to be taught or learned. So I've caught and landed more really large fish, 18, 22, 24-inch long trout on a size 18 fly. Typically a size 18 PT is my favorite go-to because it's in almost all the rivers there are in the United States. And I even found it in Russia when I went there back in '93.
And what was that again? Sorry,
but
I missed that, Dan.
Yeah, I got invited to come fish on the Kola Peninsula of Russia in 1993 by a guy that we did business with. I bought fly fishing books for the store in San Francisco Orvis store for, and he was a partner in it. And he called up one day and he said, "Hey, how would you like to come fish in Russia for Atlantic salmon?" I said, "Well, that'd be great fun, Herb, if I had, about $10,000 or $15,000. I said, it's $8,500 for a week there." And he said, "Nah, it wouldn't cost you that much." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "No, I'm a partner there. I'd like to comp to you. You just have to get there." And had some trouble that year, but the next year, by God, I went, and it was amazing. Spent a week there. Hooked 40 Atlantic salmon, landed 24 of them, lost a couple of really big fish, and my partner Phil landed a 32-pound, I think it was, a 32-pound Atlantic salmon. Somewhere I've got a picture of him, and he's holding this thing up, and it's, here's the top of it, and down here is the bottom of it, and he's peeking his head open with his eyes like this. Wow! And I actually helped him land that fish. It was, we were fishing on the Umba River, and you would go all the way up to the Pozo Zero, was a lake that this part of the river came out of. And the river was pretty shallow, very wide, 300 yards wide in most places, but it was pretty shallow. I mean, it was mostly waist deep, a little deeper, but there was just one slot on the far side that was about 6 feet deep, and there's a great big rock standing out there. And whoever went down that way first got a big fish. I got 16-pound fish out of that 3 times. And so this time Phil was going down first, and he's hooked, and he hooks into a fish. And I said, he's got a nice one. And then boom, I hooked up. So I'm playing this fish, and I land my fish. It was about a 10-pound steelhead, and let it go. And then I hear Victor, his guide, say, Dan, cast me your line. And I went, cast my line? Cast me your line. And what had happened was the fish had gone down and then come back up, and the water was too deep, and the guide couldn't pull the thing back up because the guides just held onto the boat and walked you around, held onto the raft, and he couldn't get around, so it was wrapped around this rock, and he had no way of landing it. So I cast him my line. He wanted it with a hook on it, and he hooked it around the line. He said, "Okay, pull."
Oh, wow.
And so I'm pulling, and sure enough, I get this fish to come back around, and then he goes back down the other side and takes off, and my line comes loose when he does that. And it was still another 10 minutes before Phil landed that fish, but it was
what teamwork. That is pretty huge. On the spot right there.
Oh, God, it was, yeah. Okay, pull.
So what's the technique of fighting big fish?
Okay, so the very basic, the very simple thing you have to remember is when that fish is not pulling, you're pulling hard. When that fish shakes his head, when that fish jumps, when that fish pulls hard, you ease up. And it's a give and take. Also, when you first hook into a fish, move. Because it usually takes a big fish a while to figure out, hey, I'm hooked up. One of the things at the Take It Easy Ranch was there were a bunch of these, 3-foot thick trees that had fallen over, and the dang fish would all kind of stack up underneath there because you couldn't get a nymph to it because it would hit the front and they're holding in the back too much. So hopper time, fish move a lot. Threw a hopper out there, and this big fish, he was about a 5-pound fish, comes up and takes it, choomp, like that. And I set the hook, and I immediately take 3 steps back, which pulls him away from all the cover that he had. So if you're fishing a big fish, they usually have takes them a second to realize something's got them before they start fighting. So use that to your advantage and move away from the cover that he's in. Pull him back out. Pull him into slower water, away from structure, whatever. And then the other thing is, when he's shaking his head, you just as the old saying goes, bow to the fish when they jump. Bow to the fish when he shakes to his head, because what that does is that lets some tension off and allows this to bend much more easily. Whereas if you've got him up tight and this is, bent as far as it's going to go, and then he shakes or jumps or anything like that, pop, away you go.
Yeah.
So you use that, and when he's not running, when he's not jumping, when he's not shaking his head, you put the stick to him and guide him where you want him to go. Don't guide him towards the main part of the current. That current fights you. Instead, you move them over to the edges. And just experientially, I have found that as long as I keep my rod no more than about a 45-degree angle to either side, I can make the fish go that way, because you move his head, and he can only follow where his head goes. So, I can move it over here, and if he starts wanting to go over there, I'll move it the other way. I want to take him where he doesn't want to go, as long as I'm not leading him into cover. And that will tire them out fairly quickly. And then when you if you have a big fish and you start getting his head up above the water, try and take this and go whoop, like that. And what that does is that rolls him over, and that really disorients him. And then you can land him pretty darn quickly when that happens, and you can get him in. But basically, as long as he's not pulling, you're pulling hard. You get a good bend in it. Don't ever let your rod get to the point where you're down and the rod starts flattening out like that, because you just lost all of your shock absorber when that happens. So, you don't want too much. You don't want too little. You want it just right. And you'll be amazed. I mean, I would take an 18-inch fish on the Take It Easy Ranch, and I hooked him behind a log that was in the stream, and I got his head up, and he did a little bump, and then he stopped, and I pulled him over the log. Literally, with 6X tippet, I pulled this, this 20-inch fish over the log. And, but it'll take a lot as long as it's smooth, even pressure. But that jerking is what breaks everything. So you want to avoid that built
really
up, makes a huge difference.
That built up energy to a stop is where you get in trouble. And I like how you talked about kind of easing up. And I always think of, Oh, like public speaking and debate. You call it your bow to your rebuttal. So your fish is going in and out of rebuttal, right? And so you bow every
Sure.
time the
Yeah.
rebuttal occurs, and you dip your
Yep.
tip a little bit. And like you said, if you're always at
Yep.
45, you're always steering in a direction, right? So left or
Yep.
right. And then
Exactly. Exactly.
for me, the way I always remembered of turning the head, and the head is what drives the fish, is
Yeah.
I was a wrestler. And my coach used to say all the time,
Oh.
you put your
Yeah.
hand on
Sure.
his head, or
Yeah.
wherever their head goes, where they're going to go. And that's why you see all these wrestlers with these big necks and whatnot. And it's like, yeah, right, you're right. Push that head to the side, they're going to
Yeah.
go to the side, or lift
Yeah.
it up, or tuck it under. So
Yep.
very good. Well, you covered a
Yeah.
lot, Dan.
Yeah. Yeah. And fish just because.
Yeah, you covered a lot.
And fish just because of the way they're shaped, they don't have a choice. They got to go where they.
Yeah, they're very linear in nature.
So.
Yeah, very linear in nature. Let's do this. Let's wrap up. You touched on it a little bit, but let's wrap up with our tip about fishing spring creeks with nymph indicators, and how you kind of watch that and change that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So number one, you always want to make sure that your indicator is as small as it can be that will successfully float stuff. So on a spring creek, I use maybe a little bit of yarn that might be that big, whereas on a freestone stream it might be this big. Because I don't need this big, I need that big. Also, don't use red. Don't use red. Don't use hot orange, particularly if those places have get much pressure. I learned that early on when we were teaching schools at the Take It Easy Ranch. There was another area up near the source near the lake that was a source of the river, and there were a bunch of fish across there, and they were underneath and just slightly in front. You could reach them. You could get a nice drift through with a nymph there. And typically everybody was using the pinch-ons, and they were using them in orange and red because they could see them so easily. So I'm watching this and having a student get, nice drift. This is going to go right to him. Here's the fish. Here's the fish. Here comes the fly right like this. And he sees that red indicator and he goes like this, waits for it to go by and comes back out. So green is good. They see green a lot. White is good, except it's really hard to see white in a
in the glare and stuff,
in the foam line. It's just it's really, really hard. But green works really well. So I like to use green. I like to use green yarn for mine. And again, in spring creeks, you can often see the fish that you are going to fish to, and that's wonderful because you can see it, you can cast to it, you can make your presentation, you can watch how the fish reacts to your presentation, and you can adjust that presentation. And sometimes that means, okay, he tried to take it twice and I missed him. He's probably not going to come back for that a third time because it hurts to get momentarily stuck, and pain is a great teacher. So change it up, go smaller, go larger. Smaller is usually a better choice in places that get a lot of pressure, just simply because most people don't fish that small, 18, 20, 22, and when I lived back east, people were fishing 24 and 26. I pretty much never went below 22, but I always got I shouldn't say always, but I generally got a really good dead drift. So I was successful. But use that indicator as a drift indicator when you're in a spring creek, when it gets within about 2 feet of the fish. And then you'll be amazed at how many more fish that you'll catch, because most of the time, probably 4 to 5 times that a fish takes a fly, you might get one indication of it. In a spring creek. We did schools on Hot Creek, and actually we did them on Hot Creek, but also Hat Creek in Northern California. And there's these channels that go down and drop off the hill and go into the next part of the river. And we would take students along there because you could see them. They weren't too deep and you could see them pretty well. And then we would demonstrate this, and you'd say, okay, now watch the indicator while I do this. And they're watching the indicator, nothing happens, I would fish. And the indicator never moved. Okay, so then I do it again, and you watch again. Now watch the fish, and as the indicator comes by, you see the fish go do this little snap, 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 and the indicator doesn't move. So you only get an indication in those kind of situations one out of
Yeah.
about every 4 times. And if you can watch the fish when you get in there, you'll see him make the feeding move. Again, this is Spring Creek situations where the water is slow and clear, or sometimes fast and clear. Archelaris Ranch had some fast and clear places where we used to do schools. But, you know, the big deal was you could find them. And then once you've gotten those skills, you can take them anywhere. You know, they work just fine on Spring Creeks. I'm sorry, on Freestone streams. But the problem is you just got to know where the fish are. And that's very simple, because follow the main part of the current. Wherever the main part of the current is a main delivery of food. And along the edges of that food, or in the middle of it, if there's some big rocks in there, you ever see some really heavy current coming along and then kind of a flat part in the middle of it, and it's all boisterousy and going along and flat. That flat part in the middle of it, odds are there's a fish there, because there's protection there, and that water is moving quiet, and you can stay in that and just snack as it comes out. Bloop, just the head just snaps out and gets it. Comes and snaps out and gets it. So, you know, it's actually pretty easy to find them if there's a decent population there. You just follow where the main delivery is, where the main current is, the main delivery of food, and then you fish the edges, and you fish the soft parts of that, and you'll get fish.
You indicated
it all comes together.
You talked about how they feed too, and I like how you visually showed that, because usually when you see fish eat a nymph, they move left and right, and then they stop, open their mouth, and the flow goes into their mouth. It's not like the fish is actively, only maybe 10% of the time is the fish actively kind of shooting and eating. And that's usually on an emerger pattern, right? Yeah. Something they're chasing, etc. But as in a nymph floating, it's usually just this open up, came in, etc. And without that, they're not setting the hook. They're not taking away the slack and getting the tension on the line, so they have time to spit it out, etc. So I really like how you described that. Well, Dan, I gotta say, it was great having you on the show, man. You know, obviously Dean taught you a ton. It was a serendipitous moment for you. It's lasted a lifetime. You've become an incredible angler. So thanks for being on the show and sharing all your techniques. Guys, you know, take some of this with you. Go give it a try. Dan Gracia, it is Dan Gracia. I appreciate it.
Close enough. Yes.
we'll get your contact information in there, and we'll get you set up here. So, Dave, thanks again. Talk to you guys soon.